a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times, and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Mel Gibson went quiet for a moment.
There is a Bible that most of the Christian world has never opened. It isn't hidden in a vault or locked away by anyone. It's printed, sold, read aloud every week in thousands of churches, and has been for over 1,000 years. It just happens to live mostly in one country, Ethiopia, and it contains far more than the version most Western readers grew up with. The standard Protestant Bible has 66 books. The Catholic Bible has 73. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church recognizes 81. That gap isn't a rounding error or a footnote. It represents an entirely different history of how Scripture was collected, translated, and preserved, one that unfolded almost completely outside the control of Rome, Constantinople, or any European institution. To understand why, you have to go back to the 4th century, to a shipwreck, a royal court, and a language that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world quite the way it exists in Ethiopia. The traditional account, recorded by the Byzantine historian Rufinus, begins with 2 young men from Tyre in modern Lebanon, Frumentius and his companion, sometimes identified as his brother Adesius. Sometime around the year 340 A.D., their ship was seized off the Ethiopian coast. The boys were taken inland to Aksum, the capital of the Aksumite kingdom, a powerful trading empire that controlled much of the Red Sea coast. There, the king put them to work at court. Frumentius eventually became secretary to the king, and after the king's death, he stayed on as an advisor to the queen and tutor to her young son, the crown prince Ezana. Frumentius used his position to support the small Christian community already present in Aksum from Roman traders passing through port cities like Adulis, and he encouraged the practice of faith. Eventually, he traveled to Alexandria, in Egypt, and asked the bishop there, Athanasius, the same Athanasius who played a central role in the theological debates of his era, to send someone to shepherd the growing Christian population in Aksum. Athanasius' answer was to consecrate Frumentius himself as bishop around 347 A.D. and send him back. When Ezana came of age and took the throne, he made Christianity the state religion of Aksum, somewhere around 330 to 350 A.D. That decision matters enormously in world history. It made Aksum one of the very first kingdoms anywhere, and the first in sub-Saharan Africa, to adopt Christianity as an official state religion, doing so at almost exactly the same moment the Roman Empire itself was moving in the same direction under Constantine. It's worth pausing on how unusual this is. Ethiopia didn't receive Christianity as a colonial import centuries later, the way much of the rest of Africa did. It received it directly, early, and through its own royal court, at essentially the same time as the core of the Roman world. When Frumentius first brought Christian liturgy to Aksum, the language of worship was Greek, since that was the language of the Alexandrian church he came from. But as Christianity spread beyond the royal court and into the countryside, Greek stopped being useful. Most Aksumites didn't speak it. Over time, the liturgy shifted into Guizi, the Semitic language already used in Aksumite administration and inscriptions. Guizi is not related to Amharic, the most widely spoken language in Ethiopia today. In the way people sometimes assume, it's an older, distinct Semitic language, and it eventually stopped being anyone's native spoken tongue, probably by the 6th or 7th century. But it never disappeared. It simply moved into the same role that Latin held in Western Europe. The language of scripture, liturgy, and scholarship maintained and studied by clergy and scribes long after ordinary people stopped speaking it in daily life. Every Old and New Testament book, along with everything unique to the Ethiopian tradition, was translated into and preserved in Guizi, and it remains the church's liturgical language to this day. This translation effort didn't happen all at once. Early work began under Frumentius, covering the most essential texts needed for worship, like passages from the Psalms. The project expanded significantly in the late 5th century with the arrival of a group of monks remembered in Ethiopian tradition as the 9 Saints, who are said to have come from Byzantine territory. Alongside founding monasteries and working to establish Christianity more firmly outside Aksum's urban centers, they contributed heavily to translating scripture and liturgical works into Guizi. By the 6th century, the broad strokes of a Guizi biblical text were substantially in place. Here's the part that explains almost everything else. The Ethiopian church was never under Roman or Byzantine political authority, and after the 5th century, it wasn't even in full communion with either. In 451 AD, a major church council was held at Chalcedon in modern Turkey to settle a theological dispute about the nature of Christ, specifically how his divine and human natures relate to one another. The council's conclusions were accepted by Rome and by the Byzantine Imperial Church, but rejected by several churches in the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean world, including the Egyptian Coptic Church, the Syriac Church, the Armenian Church, and, through its close relationship with Alexandria, the Ethiopian Church. These churches are now generally grouped together as the Oriental Orthodox Communion, distinct from both the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church that trace their authority through Constantinople and Rome. This wasn't a dispute about which books belong in the Bible. It was a Christological dispute. But its consequence was that Ethiopia's church developed for the next 15 centuries with no obligation to align its practices, its calendar, or its scriptural collection with decisions being made in Rome or Constantinople. Combine that with Ethiopia's geography, highland terrain, a degree of political independence that meant it was never absorbed into European colonial empires the way most of the rest of Africa eventually was. And you get a church that simply kept building its own canon of scripture on its own terms, without ever needing to reconcile it with anyone else's list. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's Bible is generally described as containing 46 Old Testament books and 35 New Testament books, for a total of 81. It's worth being honest that even this number is a bit of convention rather than a single fixed, universally agreed inventory. Ethiopian canon lists have varied somewhat over history and across sources. The church's legal code, the Fetha Nagast, cites an earlier canon law text called the Synodos, and only explicitly names 73 books before noting that the total should be 81, leaving scholars and later Ethiopian writers to work out exactly which additional texts fill the gap. Some editions split books like Proverbs or Samuel and Kings differently than Western Bibles do, which affects the count without necessarily changing the content. So 81 is best understood as the church's traditional shorthand for a substantially larger and different canon, rather than a single uncontested checklist. What is uncontested is which texts make the Ethiopian Bible genuinely distinctive, because these are books that exist nowhere else in a complete form, or that dropped out of every other Christian tradition scripture centuries ago. The most famous is 1 Enoch, often just called the Book of Enoch. It's presented as containing visions and teachings attributed to Enoch, a pre-flood patriarch mentioned briefly in Genesis. Enoch was known and quoted by some early Christian writers. It's directly referenced in the New Testament book of Jude, but it fell out of use almost everywhere else. For centuries, the West only had it in fragments and second-hand quotations. It survived complete only in Guizi, copied and recopied inside Ethiopian monasteries. Western Europe didn't see a full text again until the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought 3 Guizi copies back from Ethiopia in 1773, over 1,000 years after the West had effectively lost it. Before that, at least one prominent European scholar of Ethiopic literature was skeptical it was even authentic, suspecting a later forgery. That skepticism didn't hold up. When fragments of Enoch in Aramaic later turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century, they confirmed that the core of the book really did circulate in ancient Jewish communities centuries before Christianity even began, meaning the Ethiopian Guizi text had faithfully preserved something genuinely ancient that the rest of the world had simply let slip away. Alongside Enoch sits the Book of Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis and part of Exodus organized around a special calendar system, also known from Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, but preserved complete only in Guizi. There's also a text sometimes called the Paralipomena of Jeremiah, or For Baruch, describing events connected to prophet Jeremiah and the Babylonian exile. And there are the 3 books of Maccabean, sometimes called the Ethiopian Maccabees, which, despite the similar name, are different in content from the 1 and 2 Maccabees found in Catholic Bibles. On the New Testament side, the Ethiopian canon includes the same 27 books found in every other Christian Bible, but adds a set of texts generally called the Books of Church Order, sometimes grouped under the name Synodos, early Christian material dealing with church discipline, liturgy, and community organization. Texts in the West are typically studied by historians as important early Christian documents, but were never treated as scripture. None of this material was smuggled out of a Roman archive or rescued at the last minute from a burning library. It simply never left. Ethiopian monks kept copying it, generation after generation, because it was already part of their tradition before anyone in Rome or Constantinople had the standing to tell them otherwise. If you want proof of just how old and continuous this manuscript tradition is, the strongest evidence sits in a monastery near Adwa, in Ethiopia's Tigray region. The Garima Gospels, named after a monk, Abba Garima, who local tradition says arrived from Constantinople in the late 5th century and copied the entire text in a single day, with God supposedly holding back the sunset so he could finish. For a long time, some Western art historians assumed that it was pious legend and dated the manuscripts to the 11th century or later, on the theory that Ethiopian monks were simply imitating Byzantine artistic styles long after fact. That assumption didn't survive contact with the evidence. When samples of the parchment were sent for radiocarbon dating by Oxford researchers, the results placed the two Garima Gospel manuscripts between roughly 390 and 660 AD, meaning they are very plausibly the oldest surviving illustrated Christian manuscripts in the world, older than anything comparable produced in Europe. The monks' own oral tradition turned out to be closer to the truth than the skeptical Western academic consensus had been. It's tempting to frame all of this as a story of censorship. Powerful men somewhere deciding which books were too dangerous and cutting them from an original, complete Bible. That's a compelling narrative. But it isn't really what happened, and it flattens something more interesting. There was no single meeting where a unified, complete Christian Bible existed, and then had books forcibly removed from it. The New Testament and Old Testament canons used across the Christian world today emerged gradually, over centuries, through overlapping regional councils and traditions in different cities. Carthage, Laodicea, Rome, Alexandria, and others, each way in which texts were read in worship and considered authoritative in their own community, often disagreeing with each other for a long time before broad consensus settled out in various regions. The Ethiopian church wasn't cut out of that process by an outside decision. It was simply never plugged into it in the first place. It had its own councils, its own legal and canonical tradition through texts like the Synodos and the Fetha Nagast, and its own relationship with Alexandria that didn't pass through Rome or Constantinople after the split following Chalcedon. It built its list independently, kept what its own tradition already valued, including books others had let go of, and never had a reason to trim it down to match anyone else's. That's a very different story than a conspiracy. It's a story about isolation actually functioning as preservation. Because Ethiopia's church operated outside the political and theological machinery of the Roman and Byzantine world, and because the country was never fully absorbed into a European colonial empire the way most of the rest of Africa eventually was. Its scribes simply never got the instruction, implicit or explicit, to standardize their scripture to match anyone else's shorter list. The monasteries kept copying Enoch and Jubilees, and the rest for the same reason. They kept copying the Gospels, because that's what their tradition told them to preserve. Interest in the Ethiopian biblical tradition has grown in recent years, partly through documentaries, popular history content online, and renewed academic attention to Guizi manuscripts, some of which are now being digitized and made accessible to researchers and the public for the first time. That attention is well earned. This is one of the oldest continuously functioning Christian textual traditions on earth, maintained through hand-copied manuscripts on parchment, in a language most people alive today cannot read, inside monasteries that have operated for well over 1,000 years. But it's worth engaging with the real history, rather than an invented one. The Ethiopian canon doesn't need a hidden conspiracy to be remarkable. The real story is already extraordinary. A kingdom that adopted Christianity at almost the same moment as Rome, a scribal culture that preserved ancient Jewish texts intact after the rest of the world lost them, manuscripts whose age was doubted by Western scholars until modern science proved the local tradition right, and a living church that still reads from books most of the world has simply never had the chance to open. The 81-book Bible is a secret. It's just been sitting in plain sight, in a place the rest of Christian history didn't think to look.